So let's continue concerning ourselves with what the baton's doing when it comes to language in this early part, so you can transfer that to the way in which you're going to engage and read this text. Having worked on this, reading this text and making notes earlier this week, and now we can go back and start thinking about what matters in terms of his language. So the early part, of course, as I've stated before, simplistically paints a picture of sort of downward feeling due to the environment and the weather. So remember that we're talking about representation of people and landscapes. And so the call to move, the call to travel, and the call of anticipation is all in these first few sentences and paragraphs. And the language is suggestive of that. When we see a sentence like, by December, the new season was entrenched and the city was covered almost every day by an ominous, steely grey sky, like one in a painting by Mantina or Veronese, the perfect backdrop to the crucifixion of Christ or to a day beneath the bedclothes. It goes from the absolute wondrous imagery of Christ's crucifixion to just a day in bed. So he's playing with our emotions in that way, almost has a humorous bent to his writing there. But the language that we concern ourselves with are words like entrenched, words like ominous, steely grey, and these words are suggestive of the environment being impactful on the emotion, and also the environment having almost that personification effect. Remember to use that terminology. This is representation and text. We always should be talking about how language is working, particularly when we're dealing with a work like this, which is a non-fiction. Okay? The neighbourhood park became a desolate spread of mud and water, and I shouldn't have to point it out, of course, that we then go, there's that word desolate. The continuing imagery is there, it's maintained. He is obviously going for a sense and a feeling and an emotion. Lit up at night by rain street lamps, passing it one evening during a downpour. It's about the third or fourth time that we've come across the fact that it's raining. Okay? And it's interesting that I always find people say rather funny statements like, the Eskimo people have 150 words for snow, as if that's something weird and unusual. Well, you'll note that the English have about 500 words to describe rain. Of course, you have a lot of words to describe an item or a thing, because you're not describing it, you're describing the emotional sense of it, the feeling of it snowing or the feeling of it raining, dependent on your mood and dependent on the person who's talking about it within that landscape, central to what they're trying to represent. This guy is trying to represent that depressive nature or oppressive nature of the English in London, whether the grey skies of London. I recalled how, in the intense heat of the previous summer, I had stretched down on the ground and let my bare feet slip from my shoes to caress the grass, and how this direct contact with the earth had brought with it a sense of freedom and expansiveness. Summer breaking down the usual boundaries between indoors and out, and allowing me to feel as much at home in the world as in my own bedroom. Well, there we go. There is almost the romantic at heart. The idea that the connection to nature is a simple, easy, effective, but evocative one. That when we are within a space that we feel present, we feel connected, we feel belonging. Sorry to use that term, but there it is. And that is an obvious emotional string pull he's trying to do there in terms of the language, because we get this but. Now, the park was foreign once more, and he doesn't use wet or dark. At this point, he uses the word foreign. It has been removed from my capacity to be emotionally attached to it. The grass, a forbidding arena in the incessant rain. Any sadness I might have felt, any suspicion that happiness or understanding was unattainable, seemed to find ready encouragement in the sodden, dark red brick buildings and low skies tinged orange by the city's streetlights. The opening pages, the 2 pages that sort of are the first opening of this text, really tells us why travel is something that people desire. The greyness, wetness of London not only is cold and wet, it's isolating. Okay? Even though there's this one bit of comfort, a perfect day beneath the bedclothes, that's something that is probably desirous. The rest of it is awful. Desolation, darkness, awfulness, and the direct link and comparison to why it's different, because we get the summer version of the same space. This is an extraordinary example of that old adage that we've repeated at you many, many times, show, don't tell. And he's showing us how we feel and how he feels, because he gives us summer as well as winter, and his language changes in summer to that of winter. It's a very clever turn of phrase. Now, in terms of what happens with the actual text at this point, and what I mean by that, the book itself, the physical nature of the book, is the very next thing we see is a painting. And the painting is of an evocative and exotic landscape. Tahiti Revisited, 1776. So you get an image or a picture, a drawing, a painting, from a time when travel was used in an imperial sense. Travel was used in a way to expand an empire as well as expand a scientific knowledge. As we are no doubt aware, travel in those 1770s, one of the most famous trips, of course, being Cook's, were not only expansive ones of empire building, but they were scientific. At the heart of all of those trips seemed to be a desire to understand our world in a much more profound way. But we also get that exotic landscape in direct contrast to the description of the grey sky of London. Even though it's lacking in colour, we can imagine there is a colour in that landscape. We, as a reader, put the colour there because there's been such drabness prior. But he continues, such climactic circumstances, together with a sequence of events that occurred at around this time, and seem to confirm Chamfort's dictum that a man must swallow a toad every morning to be sure of not meeting with anything more revolting in the day ahead. It's an interesting way of putting things. Conspired to render me intensely susceptible to the unsolicited arrival one late afternoon of a large, brightly illustrated brochure entitled Winter Sun, the call to the exotic. Very, very romantic in its style. We end up with a desire to be elsewhere, a call to action, a call to movement, a call to the wild, whatever you want to call it. Again, we can argue that there's a transcendentalism going on here, much like with Frost and so forth. It has that sensibility. Its cover displayed a row of palm trees, many of them growing at an angle on a sandy beach, fringed by a turquoise sea set against a backdrop of hills, where I imagined there to be waterfalls and relief from the heat in the shade of sweet-smelling fruit trees. The photographs reminded me of the paintings of Tahiti that Hodges had brought back from his journey with Cook, showing a tropical lagoon in soft evening light, where smiling local girls cavorted carefree and barefoot through luxuriant foliage, images that had provoked wonder and longing when Hodges first exhibited them at the Royal Academy in London in the sharp winter of 1776. And that continued to provide a model for subsequent depictions of tropic idylls, including the pages of Winter Sun. So he's connecting himself with those Londoners of 250 years ago. He's suggesting that their desire to move, to be elsewhere, to travel, to explore, to expand, is the same one that he is experiencing at this point. And he's getting it from the brochure, and they got it from Hodges' paintings, from Cook's journeys in that time. And as we've discussed, or as I've discussed, those journeys had travel as a sentiment in more ways than one. It's interesting that at this point, he then pulls himself out of his own narrative. He's gone into this sequence of the brochure pulling him into a painting and artwork, and he questions the motives of the actual brochure. Those responsible for the brochure had darkly intuited how easily their readers might be turned into prey by photographs. So he understands the way in which this thing is working in terms of influencing, because it's influencing him, it's sending him as the actual center of this story into that reverie, into that moment of desire of travel. He says it's too easy for them to do that. It's so basic. Overexposed photographs of palm trees, etc. He knows it's a lie. He knows he should be skeptical, and he should be more prudent in his decision making as he decides. And he reminds us that this is a primal instinct, primordial innocence and optimism. Okay? At once touching and pathetic, not pathetic. Bathos is, of course, something that goes from the beautiful and sublime to the ordinary in one fell swoop, often used for comedic effect. Okay? Of how lengthy and ruinously expensive journey might be set into motion by nothing more than the sight of a photograph. And then we get this lovely final sentence. I resolved to travel to the island of Barbados. He goes, well, they got me. They've got me, and I resolved to travel. I didn't resolve to be a tourist. I just resolved to travel to the island of Barbados. In our day and age, probably not as exotic as it would be in, say, the 1770s or anything like that, but certainly not the grey skies of London. So we're going to have the call of action, and then we get the actual moment in the narrative that says, all right, now we're going to move somewhere. So the story is enacted properly, and he's basing this in terms of narrative flow. Even though this is a non-fiction, the form, the way in which the form is concerning itself is considerably important. So the little second section to this opening sequence stops the narrative and goes into almost soliloquy, goes into a sense of all of us feeling that way and feeling similar. In terms of the language, note that it's gone from first person to second person pretty clearly and without too much struggle or problem. If our lives are dominated by a search for happiness, then perhaps a few activities reveal as much about the dynamics of this quest in all its ardour and paradoxes than our travels. He brings us, all of us, into the narrative ourselves. The desire for happiness is not just Alain de Botton's, it is everyone's. Whether or not he's just resolved to travel to Barbados because the grey skies of London have said, I must move, or we travel for any other reason, or they travelled in Cook's Day because of the desire for empire, whatever it is, there is a quest for happiness. They express, however inarticulately, an understanding of what life might be about outside the constraints of work and the struggle for survival. So travel is, the suggestion there is he's saying, when we travel, we are moving away from the very basic nature. And so he gets into that philosophical pattern pretty quickly, which is, of course, we are inundated with advice on where to travel and little of how and why. Though the art of travel seems naturally to sustain a number of questions, neither so simple nor so trivial, and whose study, in our modest ways, contribute to an understanding of what the Greek philosophers beautifully termed eudaimonia, or human flourishing. So he suggests that's the centerpiece of his work. The art of travel is about human endeavor and human flourishing, human improvement. The why of travel is what my book will be about.